On the 17th of February, 1974, terror struck the Walker family home in Fort Worth, Texas. 18-year-old Rodney McCoy stumbled onto their porch, brutally beaten. He was barely conscious, repeating the same chilling words. "He took her. He took her." Rodney was referring to Carla Walker, the girl he had been dating for several months, who resided at that address. Before succumbing to unconsciousness, Rodney managed to tell the Walkers that Carla had vanished after an attack by an unknown assailant. In the 1970s, Fort Worth, Texas, was a far cry from the sprawling metropolis it is today, radiating a small-town feel. Perhaps this intimacy is why the brazen kidnapping and murder of Carla Walker became a crime etched into the community's memory. For nearly a decade, investigators tirelessly pursued justice for Carla's grieving family. It was February 17, 1974, 1:30 in the morning, when 12-year-old Jim Walker and his parents grew increasingly anxious. 18-year-old Carla hadn't returned from her date with her boyfriend, Rodney. As the hours ticked by, anxiety morphed into dread. Suddenly, a deafening crash shattered the night. The unmistakable sound of a car colliding with something solid. Then, a desperate cry pierced the silence. "Mr. Walker, please help me." Jim rushed outside to find Rodney staggering from the wrecked vehicle, covered in blood, but Carla was nowhere in sight. Jim's gaze turned to Rodney, whose face was etched with terror and panic. A long, deep scratch ran down his face, just beneath his eye. His injuries paled in comparison to the story of how he sustained them. The 18-year-old relative recounted that a stranger had assaulted him with a gun. The same man had then seized Carla, dragging her from a car parked near the local bowling alley. One can only imagine the reaction and state of mind of the 12-year-old boy upon hearing his relative's account. It's clear, however, that he was frightened and understood the gravity of the situation. Meanwhile, Carla's father, wasting no time, grabbed a weapon and rushed to the bowling alley parking lot while the girl's mother dialed the police. Minutes later, the authorities arrived at both locations. At the Walker residence, officers questioned Rodney's relatives. Despite his injuries making it difficult to speak, Rodney managed to recount the events to the investigators. He explained that he and Carla had gone dancing to celebrate Valentine's Day. They arrived at the disco sometime after 9 o'clock, danced for a while, and then headed to Taco Bed around 11 o'clock. Rodney ordered a burger and a soda for his date, hoping the late-night snack would be the perfect end to their lovely evening. On their way home, the couple made one final stop. Around midnight, they pulled into a bowling alley, needing to use the restroom. Minutes after returning to their car, their peaceful night turned into a nightmare. Lost in each other's embrace, they were startled when the passenger door was suddenly yanked open. A stranger began dragging Carla from the vehicle. As the assailant pulled her out, her boyfriend desperately tried to hold on to her, fighting to keep her safe. The struggle was fierce. Rodney fought back with all his might, but a chilling realization crept in. His resistance could cost him his life. He looked up, his eyes meeting the cold, dark barrel of a pistol. Understanding crashed over him. Death was a breath away. He squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable. But the shot never came. Instead, a series of clicks echoed in the tense silence. The assailant, in a fatal oversight, had forgotten to chamber a round. Rodney's world dissolved into agony as a searing pain erupted near his eye. A shadowy figure rained blows upon him with the cold steel of a pistol. Darkness crept at the edges of his vision, threatening to consume him. Through the haze, he heard Carla's desperate pleas, begging their assailant to stop the brutal assault. The man's voice cut through the chaos as he seized Carla. His words echoed in Rodney's memory. He heard the man say, "She wants to come with me," then adding a chilling invitation. "Come with me, baby." Carla's voice, laced with terror, screamed for him to be spared. As she was dragged away, her final, heart-wrenching words pierced the fog in Rodney's mind. "Call Dad." The last thing he registered was the sound, then a blinding impact swallowed him into darkness. When Rodney regained consciousness, his mind raced back to the events that transpired. Driven by a sense of duty, he made his way to the Walker residence, determined to deliver the grim news about Carl to his family. He focused intently, replaying the abduction in his mind. He had managed to get a good look at the kidnapper, a man with wavy chestnut hair, speaking with a distinct southern drawl. He stood around 1.80 meters tall, his head crowned with a distinctive cowboy hat. As Rodney was rushed to the hospital, Carl's father, fueled by a father's desperate hope, was pointing out pieces of evidence he had discovered in the parking lot to the police. These grim findings only served to corroborate the young man's terrifying account. Near the bowling parking lot, a father stumbled upon his daughter's purse and a Ruger pistol magazine. The magazine lay near the passenger door, suggesting it had dislodged when the kidnapper struck Rodney on the head. The pistol was identified as a Ruger of small caliber. Its design explained the incident. The magazine could be ejected from the base of the handle. When the kidnapper struck Rodney, the magazine came loose, ultimately saving the young man's life. Having examined the scene, the police were astounded by how brazenly close to the entrance of bowling the assault occurred. Imagine the sheer audacity and gall of it. The attacker had seized the victim practically in plain sight, as if it was some kind of risky game to them. It was a profoundly bold move, and it was evident that the perpetrator had likely engaged in similar acts before. A nerve-wracking race against time had begun. Detectives knew they had to act swiftly to find the sociopath. They understood they were dealing with someone who derived pleasure from inflicting pain and witnessing the suffering of others. But could the police find the abductor before it was too late? Fort Worth detectives were actively searching for 17-year-old Carla Walker, who had been abducted at gunpoint. Everyone knew she needed to be found as quickly as possible. The entire city rallied in this difficult situation, with many people involved in the search. Carla's family and friends hoped she would be found alive and prayed for her safe return. The Walkers weren't alone in their desperate prayers. Across Fort Worth, a stunned community grappled with the unfathomable. How could a simple school dance turn into such a horrific nightmare? Rodney was a football player, a genuinely good guy by all accounts. Carla, full of life and kindness, was cherished by friends and family alike. She loved to dance, a passion that would tragically and unknowingly lead her towards her untimely end. 47 years haven't dulled the memory of that evening for Jim. He recalls how radiant Rodney and Carla looked. They posed near the fireplace, capturing the moment with photographs, their faces lit with joy and anticipation of the dances to come. They left the house, stepping out into the night, unaware that within hours, the 17-year-old girl's happiness would be replaced by peril. Investigators were left with little to go on, a vague description of the assailant and a single piece of evidence recovered from the scene. The crucial clue was a pistol magazine, believed to be from the weapon used to strike Rodney. Detectives hoped forensic analysis of the magazine would reveal the identity of the abductor, yet they found no fingerprints or other trace evidence to lead them to the suspect. As calls flooded the police station, each describing a person vaguely resembling the assailant, investigators faced a daunting task, sifting through a sea of potential suspects. Numerous individuals were brought in for questioning. The victim, Rodney, had described his attacker as a man sporting a cowboy hat, his voice thick with a southern drawl, characteristic of local farmers. In a town like Fort Worth, this description fit a sizable portion of the male population. For the first 24 hours, law enforcement launched an exhaustive search, casting a wide net across the city. Yet, as the sun set on the third day, their initial momentum began to wane, and the investigation risked losing steam. Investigators turned their attention to the extensive network of drainage tunnels beneath the city. A chilling echo resonated from the previous year when a similar abduction had occurred within the same locale. The victim's remains were discovered within one of these very tunnels months after she vanished. A disturbing question arose. Could Carla's disappearance be linked to this unsolved murder? The investigators' fears were substantiated when, a mere 4 days after Carla Walker's abduction, law enforcement stumbled upon a lifeless body in a drainage tunnel near Benbrook Lake. The officers, desperately searching for Carla Walker, were convinced they had found her, the victim of a brutal assault. The young woman lay face up, her dress torn. Carla had clearly been the victim of a brutal crime. Her body was found in a horrifying state, marked with bruises and lacerations that made even the most seasoned officers recoil. At the scene, investigators immediately began piecing together a narrative of what could have occurred. The contusions around her neck suggested strangulation, and her dress was torn and partially removed. The initial assumption, as is often the case in such violent acts, was sexual assault. Her body was transported to the coroner's office, where Carla's grief-stricken parents faced the devastating task of identification. It was a dark era, etched forever in Jim's memory. He would never forget the horrifying moment his mother's scream pierced the night as flames engulfed her. That sound, a chilling echo of terror, haunted his darkest nightmares. The grim discovery confirmed what Detective Jim Minter had already suspected deep down. The medical examiner's report was damning. Carla had been strangled and violated. Every piece of biological evidence had been meticulously collected and preserved, offering a glimmer of hope in the bleak investigation. Furthermore, the medical examiner was able to pinpoint the exact time when Carla's life was brutally cut short. The contents of her stomach suggested she had been held for approximately 2 days after her abduction. For the residents of Fort Worth, the discovery of Carla Walker's body brought a devastating chapter to a close. However, for law enforcement, the real work had just begun. The probability of Carlon's killer striking again loomed large in their minds. Investigators worked around the clock, driven by the urgency of finding the murderer. Their focus centered on a crucial piece of evidence: the magazine that had fallen from the killer's pistol. Detectives immediately started tracing the owners of recently purchased handguns. Back then, around 30 Ruger pistols were circulating within the city, prompting a widespread police inquiry targeting all registered owners. Investigators meticulously tracked down those who had recently purchased that particular model. Officers went door to door, verifying that each pistol owner possessed a single magazine. The handgun was sold with only one magazine. Despite their efforts, authorities were unable to locate a Ruger with a missing magazine. Subsequently, all pistol owners matching the suspect's description were asked to corroborate their alibis by undergoing polygraph examinations. Regrettably, these measures also proved fruitless, leaving detectives back at square one. The investigation had stalled, forcing the detectives back to square one. A grim realization dawned upon them. Solving this case might require another life to be taken. They had to wait for a new crime, hoping fresh evidence would finally lead them to the killer. The chilling reality of hunting serial offenders. A mere 2 months after Carla's murder, their dark prophecy began to unfold. Investigators received a lead, a connection to a similar attack in Arlington, just 20 minutes from where Carla was killed. This time, however, the teenage victim had miraculously survived. 16-year-old called the police, her voice trembling as she reported a kidnapping and attempted assault. She recounted a terrifying encounter, explaining that a stranger had approached her while she was sitting in her car. He offered unsolicited assistance, and when she refused, he brandished a sawed-off shotgun, forcing her into his vehicle. As he drove away from the city, the quick-thinking teenager seized an opportunity, distracting him just enough to cause the car to veer off the road. The vehicle became mired in the mud. Her courageous act had potentially saved her life. Panicked, the man desperately tried to free the car, knowing that with each passing moment, the risk of exposure grew. Seizing her chance, the young woman made a desperate bargain. She promised the man she would never reveal the assault if only he would release her. Consumed by the struggle to free his vehicle from the mud's relentless grip, he relented and let her go. Once free, she wasted no time in reporting the harrowing ordeal to the police. The woman provided a detailed description of both her assailant and his vehicle. As a consequence, law enforcement swiftly identified him. 21-year-old Tommy Ray Nealand was apprehended. Investigators delved into his past and uncovered a surprising fact. He had once been a preacher. Typically, such individuals do not target women. Yet, Nyland confessed promptly to an attempted assault on a young woman. He was taken into custody on charges of abduction and attempted rape. But there was more to the story. As the interrogation progressed, Nyland made additional admissions. His other offenses proved to be even more disturbing than the abduction. During this process, he admitted to the murders of 2 teenagers, ages 15 and 17. Given the grim similarities to the Carla Walker case, detectives suspected Tommy Ray Neeland might also be connected to her disappearance. Heartbroken relatives were asked to participate in a lineup. Neeland stood among 4 other men. The grieving relatives stared at the men for a moment before making an unusual request. He asked each man to say, "Come with me, baby." These were the words he remembered the kidnapper uttering. Closing his eyes, the relative listened as the 5 men repeated the phrase that haunted him since Carl's abduction. Nyland's voice was the first thing to seize his attention. It was when Tommy uttered, "Come with me," that Rodney singled him out from the lineup. Investigators initially believed they had found Carla's killer, but the ensuing interrogation left them more puzzled than before. After Rodney identified Neeland, the investigators felt certain he was the one who had abducted and murdered the young woman. Yet from the very start, the interrogation defied their expectations. Nyland's behavior was peculiar. He immediately launched into a defensive tirade, vehemently denying any involvement in Carla's kidnapping and murder. Nyland faced the stark reality. Carla's boyfriend had identified him as the one who pulled her from the wreckage. The police were baffled. Had they arrested the wrong man? He had practically reveled in his initial crimes, so why the sudden reluctance to take credit for this one? Adding another layer of complexity, Neeland presented an alibi for the night of Carla's abduction. He claimed to have been 250 kilometers away in Brownwood, attending a church group meeting. Detectives verified his story, and to their surprise, found it to be true. Neeland's airtight alibi definitively cleared him as a suspect. With no connections found linking him to the crime, the police shifted their focus. The investigators pursued dozens of leads, but to their frustration, each one turned into a dead end. Then, 3 long years after Carla's murder, Detective Jim Minter received a call from a sheriff's deputy in Tennessee. The deputy informed him that an inmate named Jimmy Dean Sasser had confessed to the murder of Carla Walker. Detective Minter was stunned. Could it be that the case that had haunted him for so long was finally about to be closed? He pressed the sheriff's deputy for a complete account of the confession. He needed to know the specifics of what Sasser had admitted to. It turned out Sasser owned a Ruger pistol. Sasser, it seemed, had managed to piece together the events. Minter and his team boarded the first available flight to Tennessee, determined to apprehend Sasser. En route, the investigators felt the weight of their mission, the hope that they were close to delivering justice for Carla's family. Their goal was simple: bring him in and uncover the whole truth. Back in Fort Worth, the investigator interrogated a 31-year-old criminal. According to Sasser's account, he saw Carla and was consumed by desire. He drew a pistol, approached her, seized the girl, and engaged in a struggle with her boyfriend. He then abducted Carla and drove along the road leading to Benbrook Lake, a location well known to him. However, as he listened to Sasser's confession, Minter began to harbor doubts about the narrative. Sasser didn't fit the profile described by the family. He was a man of short stature, standing only about 1 meter and 50 centimeters tall. Detective Minter knew Rodney had described Carla's kidnapper as being 1 meter 80 centimeters tall. Could he have been so wrong about the attacker's height? Minter figured there was only one way to find out. He pressed Sasser for more details about the crime, grilling him on where exactly in the tunnel the body had been found, how far from the entrance it was, and how he'd moved the body from the car to the tunnel. Sasser confidently answered all the questions, but the answers were wrong. With each incorrect response, the detective's heart sank further. He realized swiftly, with a sinking feeling, that he had the wrong man. Investigators concluded that Sasser had intertwined publicly known facts of the investigation with his own conjectures, attempting to craft a confession that seemed authentic. A look into his record revealed several potential motives for claiming responsibility for a crime he didn't commit. Lacking education and direction, he had become mired in drug use and petty crime. He battled numerous psychological issues, teetering on the edge of stability. Following a lengthy investigation, the charges against Sasser were dropped. Sasser's name was removed from the list of suspects, and the case crumbled. The Walker family was left with nothing but their grief. Every Sunday they visited the cemetery to tend to Carla's grave. Though times were dark, they never considered giving up hope. Decades passed, and the unsolved murder remained an open wound for the residents of Fort Worth. Carla's brother, Jim, always believed her killer would eventually face justice. In 2018, he resolved to make it happen, placing a call to investigator Leah Wagner. Frustration simmered within him. After so many years, no one had been able to provide them with answers. He sought a fresh perspective, he said, and so investigator Wagner agreed to lend her expertise. Wagner, with her team, began by meticulously sifting through boxes of documents, a painstaking task. Yet, she felt compelled to aid those in need. Investigator Wagner, alongside her colleague Jeff Bennett, compiled a list of suspects connected to the case, a case that still haunted the precinct. The list contained a daunting 83 names. The investigators intended to collect DNA samples from everyone involved. However, before embarking on this extensive task, they decided to secure the highest quality DNA sample possible from the critical pieces of evidence. Back in 2009, DNA samples had been extracted from the dress, but the researchers suspected that the initial collection was incomplete. After a new round of testing, their suspicions were confirmed. A complete male DNA profile was successfully extracted from Carla's bra. Relief washed over everyone. Finally, they could upload the data to the DNA database. Investigators wasted no time uploading the newly generated DNA profile to the Federal Bureau of Investigation's national database. The result was startling. Regrettably, there were no matches to be found. At that moment, the investigation faced another dead end, leaving law enforcement with a dwindling supply of DNA evidence. Undaunted, the investigators pressed on. Their inquiries led them to a company specializing in forensic genealogy, adept at working with minuscule amounts of genetic material. The investigators sent the sample to Othram Laboratory. On the 4th of July, 2020, Jeff Bennett received a call he had been anticipating for what felt like an eternity. The voice on the other end, calling from the lab, relayed the piece of information he was so anxious to hear. They had a name. McCurley, the voice stated. Almost incredulously, Jeff inquired, "Not Glenn Emuel McCurley, by any chance?" To his utter astonishment, the reply was a simple, resounding yes. Bennett, eager to bridge the gap between past and present, quickly explained how the name Glenn McCurley had surfaced in the first place. He recounted the detail that McCurley was listed as number 22 on a list he possessed. Glenn McCurley, a 70-year-old man, found himself facing the cold scrutiny of law enforcement. He had already undergone a polygraph test, but investigators weren't satisfied. They needed more, a definitive piece of evidence, a DNA sample. The problem with the polygraph was its unreliability in court. It proved little more than a person's ability to deceive a machine. Decades ago, McCurley had sat in a similar room, telling a story that allowed him to pass a polygraph. Now, police hoped that they would find the inconsistencies and see through the lies he told almost 50 years ago. "Mr. McCarley," the voice held a note that made Mr. McCarley pause. "Do you recall us?" Even in that simple question, investigators latched onto two crucial details. McCarley stood a towering meter and 90 centimeters tall, and his words were laced with a thick southern drawl. "We spoke not long ago." Those two observations were eerily consistent with the description that Carla's boyfriend had given to the police. The photograph was placed before him. "Do you recognize this picture? What is her name? Had you ever met Carla Walker before?" The question hung in the air, thick with unspoken accusation. "Never," Mackley insisted, his voice tight. "I've never seen her, never met her, never spoken to her." Mackley clung to the belief that denying any connection to Carla would be his shield against imprisonment. He thought by denying he could get away with his crime, but that denial was his undoing. It was crucial to the investigation that he maintained his story of never encountering Carla. Then, the investigators delivered the crushing blow. DNA doesn't lie, Mr. Mackley. Your DNA was found on her body, so you were definitely there. There was no doubt in his mind. I can't confirm what I haven't done. But as the evidence against him mounted, McCurley began to crack. He knew his only option was confession. Start from the beginning. It was me. 3 hours into the interrogation, McCurley began to recount the details of his brutal and shocking crime, including the assault on the innocent man, the use of the Ruger pistol's handle as a weapon. He stammered, a chilling confession escaping his lips. I lost the store. It just slipped away. Mackley admitted to the abduction, rape, and murder of Carla. The interrogation room hung heavy with the weight of his words. Did you rape her? A detective pressed. Yes, he mumbled. And then, a blackout. I strangled her. Though tears streamed down his face, the investigators observed a disturbing lack of genuine remorse. Doubts lingered, casting a shadow over any semblance of regret. To them, his weeping seemed nothing more than a reaction to the grim reality closing in, the realization of capture and the impending end of his life as he knew it. Glenn McCurley was apprehended, accused of first-degree murder. Yet, he unexpectedly proclaimed his innocence. Finally, in August of 2021, the trial commenced. A hush fell over the courtroom as Rodney McCoy took the stand. He began to recount the tale that had haunted him since that horrific night in 1974. His testimony unfolded in complete silence, and it was evident that he had loved Carla with all his heart. His words resonated deeply, painting a vivid picture in the jurors' minds, as if they themselves were witnessing Carla through his eyes. The prosecutors felt confident. Their case against Glenn McCurley appeared airtight. They possessed compelling evidence. The crucial DNA sample found on the victim's clothing, and most significantly, the confession itself. As the courtroom screened McCurley's videotaped admission, the jury hung on every word. Some were visibly moved, tears welling up in their eyes. The turning point for many was McCurley's graphic account of how he strangled Carla. The trial reached a fever pitch when McCurley, in a dramatic turn, halted the proceedings to retract his confession. In the end, Glenn McCurley received a life sentence without parole, a victory for Detective Jim Minter, who considered it the culmination of his most arduous case. Minter felt immense pride in the police work that led to McCurley's capture, calling it the pinnacle of his career. Though Carla's life was tragically cut short, Minter held hope that her story would resonate for generations to come. She wished to be remembered as a fighter. According to Jim, Carla's spirit lived on in every one of the thousands who stood by her. This young woman left an undeniable mark on the Fort Worth community. The relentless pursuit of her killer reflected the immense strength contained within such a petite frame. Okay, here's the rewritten and formatted text in an engaging, narrative style in English, converting numbers to words. Original text provided separately. Please provide the original text you want me to rewrite here. Rewritten text. Example, replace with actual output based on your text. The old house stood on a hill overlooking the town, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at the world. Locals whispered stories of the family who once lived there, tales of joy and sorrow woven into the very fabric of the walls. One autumn evening, a young woman named Elara found herself drawn to the house, a strange pull she couldn't explain. As she stepped inside, a chill ran down her spine, and she knew her life would never be the same. The air was thick with memories, and shadows danced in the corners of her eyes. Was it a dream? Or was she truly walking through the echoes of the past?